Hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Trauma and Literature, where we're looking at Catherine Malabou's book, The Ontology of the Accident. So in the last session, we talked about Spinoza and how Malabou brings in the philosopher Spinoza in terms of how increasingly neuroscientists are looking at Spinoza as a philosopher who offered a very different kind of model of cognition compared to, let's say, the Cartesian model. Right, and Spinoza is getting increasingly important in neuroscience today, as Malabou keeps mentioning, and she refers to the works of Antonio Damasio and also others in terms of looking at how Spinoza's philosophy of cognition, of emotion, can be used, can be mapped very interestingly with some of the current works in cognitive neuroscience. Now, this is page 25 of the PDF that I'm using, and this is why Malabou talks about the poverty of philosophy, and when it comes to suffering, when it comes to cognition, when it comes to the mind, when it comes to brain, when it comes to plasticity or destructive plasticity. Because if you know, I mean, this whole book can be seen as a project that addresses this poverty of understanding, that there's no ontology of the accident in philosophical frameworks. How do you define an accident? Accident is always seen as something of an aberration, something which just happens somewhere else to someone else, etc., outside of the mappings of meaning. So how can you bring in accident as an ontological category, not just as an experiential category, but also as an epistemic / ontological category? And this is the project of this book. And at this point, which Malabou is mentioning, again, the poverty of knowledge, the poverty of any philosophical frameworks to understand the suffering brain, or the idea of the destroyed subject. And this is what she says, and let it be said that a brain has never been an object of philosophy. Granted, it plays an important role for Descartes in the passions of the soul and Bergson in matter and memory, but it remains a secondary organ that receives and transmits information without enjoying the slightest symbolic autonomy. So what she talks about here is there's no attention given to the brain as an autonomous center, as something which can sort of experience metacognition, the cognition of cognition. So brain has always been used as a connection to other kinds of philosophical frameworks, such as consciousness, such as cognition, such as emotion. But how about looking at the brain in itself as a cognitive machine, as a cognitive mechanism, as a cognitive activity, right? So that kind of engagement with the brain, philosophical engagement with the brain, is missing in current works, right? So no, it remains a secondary organ. The brain remains a secondary organ that receives and transmits information without enjoying the slightest symbolic autonomy. So the brain remains a circuit, a passage, a commute, a connection between other organs, without being looked at as a separate autonomous entity, autonomous organic category. So no philosopher has been asked whether a brain as such can feel pain, experience representations, be the center of a meaningful economy. Spinoza alone appears to be an exception to the rule. So again, the uniqueness of Spinoza, the importance of Spinoza today, is the attention he gave to the brain alone, not the brain as connected to a more distributive network of cognition, but the brain as a self-sufficient entity, as something which can sort of produce and consume and experience emotions, right? So this whole idea of auto-production and auto-experiencing of emotion is something which the brain can do, and something which Spinoza had offered a philosophical framework to study and explore in some detail. So he's the only exception among the other philosophers, who sort of looked at cognition philosophically, but never really looked at the brain as an autonomous subject, as an autonomous entity, as an autonomous organ. But Spinoza had given a certain degree of autonomy to the brain in terms of looking at how the brain experiences, or also de-experiences, how it stops experiencing. That's where the idea of destructive plasticity comes in, right? How the brain stops functioning, how the brain stops experiencing, how the brain stops regulating. And that interruption is also important in an understanding of the mechanism of the brains, right? So again, we're looking at interruption and mechanism not as ontological categories, but as connected categories through which we can understand the complexity of the brain. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of interest in Spinoza today among neuroscientists, especially Antonio Damasio. And Malabou, of course, is referring to Damasio, drawing on Damasio quite heavily. And this is a quotation which should be on the screen. Spinoza might have intuited the principles behind the natural mechanisms responsible for the parallel manifestations of the mind and body. I am convinced that mental processes are grounded in a brain's mappings of the body, collections of neural patterns that portray responses to events that cause emotion and feelings. Nothing could have been more comforting than coming across a statement of Spinoza's and wondering about its possible meaning. Right? So again, we're looking at a convergence between neurobiology and philosophy over here. And what Spinoza had offered is that how every act of cognition is an embodied activity, how the brain maps the body. So mental processes like thoughts, emotions, consciousness, all these are grounded or underpinned by the brain's mappings of the body, right? So the mapping of the body, so embodied cognition, in other words, is inactive and embodied cognition, are very important concepts in Spinoza, and of course, these are very important concepts today in neuroscience. But looking at the mental process as a collection of neural patterns which can produce emotions and feelings, and how the same neural patterns are underpinned by an embodied activity, right? So the body and the brain come together as an entanglement, right? So this is something which Damasio believes as a neuroscientist. This is something that Damasio works as a neuroscientist, and he seems to be thrilled over here, looking at how there's a very rich philosophical framework that comes from Spinoza, through Spinoza, into this kind of a monistic model of cognition. And of course, when I'm using the word monistic, I am sort of being anti-Cartesian to a certain extent, because the Cartesian cognitive model is a dualistic cognitive model, where the mind and the body, the brain and the body are different entities which cannot connect. They have different modes of cognition altogether. And consciousness for Descartes is a very brain activity, a very brain-centered activity, and any embodied underpinnings of consciousness makes it complicated, makes it anarchic, makes it unorganized, right? Whereas for Damasio, every act of consciousness, every thought process, every mental process is also simultaneously an embodied underpinning of the same thing, right? So embodiment becomes a very key category in Spinoza's philosophy, as well as in more recent works in neuroscience. Okay, now we had mentioned the concept of Conatus in the previous session, but here is Damasio as well as Malabou unpacking the concept of Conatus in some details. And what is Conatus, and how does it sort of determine and how does it connect to some of the concepts in neuroscience today? The whole idea of the life drive. In other words, the drive of the organism to live, to preserve themselves, to different kinds of neural mechanisms, to different kinds of embodied and cognitive mechanisms, right? So that drive is important. That appetite for life is important. That appetite for self-preservation is important. And that is defined philosophically as Conatus by Spinoza. And that's obviously something which connects very interestingly with the neuroscientific understanding of life drive, the drive for the organism or the system to preserve themselves, to perpetuate themselves, right? Life drive. Okay. And this should be on your screen. Again, Malabou is offering a definition of Spinoza's Conatus. A contemporary definition of Spinoza's Conatus might run as follows, and I quote, this is in quotation: "It is the aggregate of dispositions laid down in brain circuitry that, once engaged by internal or environmental conditions, seeks both survival and well-being." So there are two important categories over here: survival and well-being. So it's a collection or a congregation or conglomeration of different brain circuits, circuit processes that come together. And the purpose of this coming together is to, ensure the organism's survival and also well-being. In other words, if we can replace the word well-being with perfection. So every organism would want to produce itself as well as perfect itself. And it's simultaneous, this loop, this connection between production and perfection is something that is talked about in some details. And Conatus as a concept by Spinoza encapsulates that, captures that in a very philosophical way, as well as connecting itself to some of the recent works in neuroscience. The vital regulation, and this should be on the screen, page 26 of this book. The vital regulation proceeds from cerebral activity defined here as a shared work of cognition and emotion. So it's an ecosystem of emotion, it's an ecosystem of cognition, and that ecosystem is informed by brain processes which are also underpinned through bodily responses, through neural bodily responses, right? So again, we're looking at a very monistic model of cognition where the brain and the body come together through neural mappings. But then in a normal, happy, healthy state, every organism would exhibit conatus, in a sense that the drive towards production and preservation simultaneously. And Damasio offers a definition over here. This should be on the screen. The large compass of activities of the conatus is conveyed to the brain chemically and neurally. This is accomplished by chemical molecules transported in the bloodstream, as well as by the electrochemical signals transmitted along nerve pathways. Numerous aspects of the life processes can also be so signaled to the brain and represented there in numerous maps made of circuits and nerve cells located in specific brain sites. By that point, we have reached the treetops of life regulation, the level at which feelings begin to coalesce. Right. So the electrochemical process of neural transmission is defined here in very philosophical terms. So if conatus is an activity, if conatus is a complex activity of production and preservation, that activity is carried out chemically and neurally. Obviously, neurons carry electrochemical signals, and they so connect to each other through electrochemical signals, right? So obviously the chemical molecules are transported in the bloodstream. So look at the scientific vocabulary of Damasio over here, as well as by the electrochemical signals transmitted along nerve pathways. So the nerves connect to each other in complex pathways, sometimes through synapses, of course through synapses, but the synaptic transmission is through electrochemical processes, electrochemical signals. But then the different aspects of life that come together is a combination of those electrochemical signals, the electrochemical transmissions, and at the highest form of consciousness, as the highest form, the most healthy, happy form of consciousness, the idea of cognition combines these two activities, activity of preservation and activity of production. So consciousness can be seen, or the highest, happiest form of consciousness, the healthiest form of consciousness, could be defined in electrochemical and scientific terms as a combination of production and preservation, and by default perfection. So every organism would want to perfect their cognitive states, perfect their consciousness states, right? And that is the coalescing quality, where feelings begin to coalesce, come together. Okay, the specific concept of the differentiated identity of body and spirit developed by Spinoza allows us to imagine that he understood perfectly the role of the brain, which is precisely to ensure this unity, to incarnate it in a true sense of the word. So the brain becomes a mimetic machine to a certain extent, and what it does, the brain, it brings together just very different electrochemical transmissions throughout the body, and so the brain becomes a coalescing of the different kind of bodily neural activity that come together. The hypothesis of a transformability, so the ability to transform, of the conatus that coincides with its constant affective variability, with the mutability of its tension, intensity, and tone, lays a groundwork for thinking through the damages caused by an attack on the areas of the brain that are emotion inductors. Now, this is where the idea of trauma comes into being. So if you're looking at the Conatus, if you're looking at Conatus as an activity that ensures a seamless transmission, production, consumption of electrochemical responses, which in a way produces and preserves the organism, right, in terms of how it can think and preserve and perfect itself. What happens when that is interrupted through a shock or injury or trauma or blunt force, whatever the case may be? But what's important over here is the combination of transformability and affective variability. So what is affective variability? Affective variability are the possibilities of emotional change, the possibilities of excitement and the lack of it, right? So affective variability. So how the brain can be a variable machine, a variable vehicle, a mutable machine, in other words. So the affective economy of the brain can be mutated, sometimes naturally, sometimes organically, sometimes internally, but also sometimes externally through injury. So the affective variability is exactly where the possibilities of trauma come into being, and we need to take a look at what happens in the brain when trauma happens, either through a physical injury or an emotional injury, whatever the case may be, right? And that, of course, makes the brain a mutable machine, and that mutability contains tension, intensity, and tone, and this economy of mutability, this economy of electrochemical reactions, and how that can be mutable and how that can be brought to a halt, that understanding lays a groundwork for thinking through the damages caused by an attack on areas of the brain which are emotion inductors. So what happens if the emotion inductors of the brain, the points of the brain which induct emotions, what happens if those are attacked externally or otherwise? When the range of effects linked to the deployment of the Conatus are injured or damaged, identity is profoundly altered, effectively metamorphosed, right? And this is the concept that was interesting for us, especially if you're looking at trauma through the lens of literature, right? The whole idea of metamorphosis, how is identity metamorphosized, right, in terms of altered. So what happens when the Conatus is injured or damaged, or the activity, the seamless activity of bringing together different emotions, the seamless activity that produces and preserves and perfects the organism, what happens when that gets injured? Now, the question of identity then comes into being, and as you can imagine by now, Malabou is using identity as a very complex category, identity as a medical category, identity as an electrochemical category, identity as a neural category, but also identity as an experiential category, and by extension, an existential category, right? So identity becomes a very important condition, a very important activity. And now, when the Conatus, or the different kind of transformations which inform the Conatus, if that is injured or damaged through external processes or even internally, identity is profoundly altered, effectively metamorphosized, right? So this metamorphosization of identity is something that really brings in the idea of trauma or the accident, right? And so how do you represent this metamorphosis? And that's something we have already seen, how literature can approximate that kind of a metamorphosis, and Kafka's works is a good example of that approximation, although inadequate, but still an approximation. When a trauma occurs, the entire affective potential is influenced. Sorrow is not even possible anymore. The patient falls beyond sorrow into a state of apathy that is no longer either joyful or despairing. They become indifferent to their own survival and to the survival of others. How else can we explain indifference to murder, right? So when I talk about people who suffer from certain clinical conditions, very tragic clinical conditions which take away the ability to emote, the ability to empathize, the ability to connect to other people, right? And that ability, the disappearance of that ability, or that the production of apathy, becomes interesting because it takes away any possibility of sorrow or joy. So it's not even enough to say the subject is sad or sorrowful or mourning. Even that disappears, right? Because expression of sorrow, expression of tragedy, expression of despair, that entails a certain kind of connection, a certain quality of connection. Now, what Malabou talks about over here is a clinical detachment, the coalesce, which comes due to extreme trauma, extreme damage to the brain or damage to the Conatus. Now, what it does is the subject, it completely loses their ability to preserve themselves as well as to value anything else, right? And this is interestingly comparable to a certain extent with the Freudian melancholia, where the value of the ego begins to disappear, or the subject's valuation of their own ego begins to disappear. But then there is a degree of sorrow in melancholia as well. But Malabou talks about a complete disappearance of sorrow. There's no sorrow left. It's a complete shall we say, a liquidation or shutting down of the subject's, conatus, the activity of conatus, right? So, and this is the idea of indifference, indifference as an experiential, but also as a medical category, right? So, someone is indifferent to something. Okay, and now Malabou offers. So Malabou offers here an extreme and tragic example of an accident or a case of violence, human violence, and that case exemplifies this state of being, emotionless, the state of being completely liquidated or apathetic to anyone else. So on December 18, 2004, Romain Dupuy, a former patient of Pau Hospital in the Pyrenees, entered the hospital by breaking through a skylight. He killed 2 nurses, attacking their bodies viciously and going so far as to decapitate one of them. He did not appear to know the victims, who were killed simply because on the night they happened to be in the residence closest to where he stayed when he was there, writes a local newspaper. At the same time, some patients were watching television on which Dupuy placed a severed head before fleeing. Some of them therefore witnessed the crime without saying a word. It is difficult to know what is worse, the murders or the indifference of the spectators who saw everything and did not react. So obviously what is described over here is a very graphic and tragic as well as very violent act of attacking nurses in a hospital, viciously in terms of decapitating, beheading one of them. But that violence obviously is deeply disturbing and unsettling. But what is also disturbing and perhaps equally unsettling is what Malabou says, the indifference of the people who just watched it without intervening at any point, and they just continued. The patients continued to watch television, which was played in that particular ward, right? And again, the attack on the nurses did not have any motive, so there was no intention or vendetta or revenge that may have triggered that attack. That's barbaric, but still, there's no narrative, which sort of has a causal link on the attack. The nurses were attacked because they just happened to be there at that point of time, and also equally the complete indifference of the people who just were spectators of the entire barbaric and tragic and brutal act. Right. So Malabou is trying to theorize it now. She's trying to say what causes this indifference. So what is the medical, existential, emotional quality of this emotionlessness, right? So this ontological quality of this emotionlessness, this apathy. It might be objected that in this instance, both the executioner and the spectators were psychiatric patients and were not, strictly speaking, brain damage, right? So there's no, medically speaking, they don't have brain damage, but they were psychiatric patients. So maybe that's the difference in some sense. But while it is true that all psychic illness, schizophrenia is the clearest example, causes an attack, and this is the next page, causes an attack on the emotional brain, particularly the frontal lobe. It is not possible to grasp the coolness of the killer or the indifference of the spectators without referring to brain injuries that cause sometimes total and irremediable loss of emotion, right? So this is the key point over here that Malabou is highlighting, emotionlessness, right? So this complete lack of emotion, and we know it through different kinds of studies, and we obviously have read it in fiction as well, that there's a very interesting and complex connection between emotion and cognition, right? In the sense that, if the ability to emote disappears, that also begins to compromise you cognitively at some level. There's no need to look for extreme examples to understand to what point injuries to the emotional brain are true threats to vital regulation and hence survival. So this is an extreme example which was offered over here, a brutal and violent attack on the human body and the human indifference to that. But what Malabou is saying is that there are also other examples that we can think of. You don't have to go to such extreme examples, but suffice it to say that injuries to the emotional brain can be a threat to the vital regulation, and that regulation, of course, is Conatus. The brain's innate ability to regulate itself or to auto-regulate itself in terms of what it produces and consumes, right? The production and consumption of affect and how it's regulated. That is the Conatus. If that quality of regulation, that ability to regulate disappears, then obviously that comes from somewhere. So injuries to the emotional brain can become a threat to that regulation, and hence, by extension, to survival. Because if you look at survival as an activity of auto-regulation, right? So that becomes that begins to become compromised quite clearly. And this should be on the screen. There's growing evidence that feelings, along with the appetites and emotions that most of them, cause them, play a decisive role in social behavior, right? So feelings play a very social role in social behavior, along with appetites and emotions, right, which are caused by feelings, or which cause feelings. After the onset of the brain lesion, these patients are generally not able to hold on to their pre-morbid social status, and all of them cease to be financially independent. They usually do not become violent, and their misbehavior does not tend to violate the law. Nonetheless, the proper governance of their lives is profoundly affected. It is apparent that if left to their own devices, their survival with well-being would be in serious question. The spouses note a lack of empathy. The wife of one of our patients noted how her husband, who previously reacted with care and affection anytime she was upset, now reacted with indifference in the same circumstances. Patients who prior to the disease were known to be concerned with social projects in their communities, or who were known for the ability to counsel friends and relatives in difficulty, no longer show any inclination to help. For practical purposes, they are no longer independent human beings. So what is interesting over here is the concept of independence, the autonomy that is there in human beings. In order to have an autonomy, the human subject must be able to connect to other subjects. In other words, autonomy is an intersubjective phenomenon. So for someone to become autonomous, that autonomy must be apropos or relative to an intersubjective economy. There should be other subjects that that particular subject should be able to connect to, and only then autonomy would operate as an electrochemical, emotional, social, existential process. Now, the idea of empathy becomes obviously important, and empathy, of course, as a neural embedded motor mechanism, but also empathy as a social, extended, and enactive mechanism, something which sort of operates outside the subject in terms of how the subject connects to social causes, political causes, cultural causes, but also in terms of how the subject connects to other human beings, in terms of seeing how the subject reacts when some other human being suffers or grieves or is happy. Right now, that ability to empathize disappears completely with the idea, with the particular brain damage that we're talking about, or the emotional damage we're talking about. Now, we can see how this can be very interestingly mapped to something like Mrs. Dalloway, where we have the idea of the PTSD veteran, or the post-traumatic stress disorder person. The soldier comes back from the war in Mrs. Dalloway, and the recursive quality in his state is that his ability to empathize disappears. He cannot empathize anymore. He cannot connect anymore to anything around him. He cannot connect to his wife. He cannot connect to the mechanisms around him. He cannot connect to any social causes. So, and this is exactly what has been talked about over here. So, emotional damage, the biggest causality of emotional damage is a lack of empathy, or the disappearance of empathy. And empathy obviously is connected to emotion, to cognition, to the ability to connect to other human beings. That disappears entirely. And this is where Malabou brings in the concept of destructive plasticity. The individual's history is cut definitively, breached by the meaningless accident, an accident that is impossible to reappropriate through either speech or recollection, right? So the accident is somewhere outside the ambit of speech or representation or recollection, something which cannot be remembered, something which is dismembered. So this accident is a dismembering act, something which cuts, amputes something. Right? And this amputation is something which happens at a cerebral, organic, emotional level. In principle, a brain injury, a natural catastrophe, a brutal, sudden, blind event cannot be reintegrated retrospectively into experience. These types of events are pure hits, tearing and piercing subjective continuity and allowing no justification or recall in the psyche. How do you internalize a cerebral lesion? How do you speak about emotional deficit, since words must be carried by the effects whose very absence is precisely what is in question here? Now, this is the question, the central question in this book, really. So how do you represent something which is essentially unrepresentable? Because in order to use language meaningfully, that must be an affective activity with emotions. You must be able to represent true emotions. And if the ability to emote disappears, if the ability to emotionalize disappears entirely, obviously that begins to impair representation, that begins to impair language, that begins to impair your navigation with language. So in other words, how do you represent the unrepresentable? This is the philosophical question, the broad philosophical question in this book. What is the ontology of the accident? How do you ontologize something which is sort of deontologizing? You know, an accident is an amputation. It cuts, it breaches, it causes an interruption in an ontological narrative continuity. So how do you give a name to the interruption is what this book tries to engage with. Right, so this is exactly the question here, because how can you speak about something, how can you use language when your emotional, the emotional deficit is there, you know, the deficit which causes you not being able to speak? Because if you take a look at something like Mrs. Jalloway, you find quite clearly Septimus cannot talk about what is happening inside him. He's just experiencing a stream of consciousness, which may or may not have any meaning or any meaningfulness attributed to those. Right? This is the core question over here. So these questions help us draw attention to the increasing gap between classical psychoanalysis and contemporary neurobiology. This is a diverse that can and must also become a space of dialogue. What is at stake is destructive plasticity. And I'll stop at this point today, but so what we can see is Malabou using destructive plasticity as some kind of a bridge and also an aporia between classical psychoanalysis and contemporary neurobiology. And she says that lack of representation of the accident, the lack of representation of emotion, and how do you represent emotionlessness, how do you represent accident, how do you represent trauma, so that representational quality is the aporia, the gap between, the impassable gap between classical psychoanalysis and contemporary neurobiology. And the ambition of this project, the ontology of the accident, is to convert this gap into a dialogue, is to make a transformation. How does the gap become a dialogue? How do you convert that into something which is a dialogue, which can trigger some kind of a new research, which can connect very originally and very uniquely classical psychoanalysis and contemporary neurobiology, right? And that concept of destructive plasticity comes into being, you know, something which has destructive plasticity. So a plasticity which is destructive in a sense that it takes away or does away with the subject's understanding of themselves as an ontological subject, as an ontological continuous subject. And in the sense that the continuous subject begins to disappear, right? There's this discontinuity, a permanent discontinuity, which is disruptive plasticity. How do you define discontinuity? In other words, in medical terms, in existential terms, in philosophical terms, in neurochemical terms. So this transmission of neurochemicals, this transmission of electrochemicals, when it stops, how do you define and locate the stop? How do you define the interruption, which then extends into so many other social behavior, like lack of empathy, lack of feeling, lack of engagement, complete withdrawal of all kinds of cognitive and emotional connect, right? So that manifests themselves in so many ways, right? This manifestation is a social and inactive and quality. But at the core of it is a study of emotionlessness. At the core of it is a study of apathy, is a study of indifference. Indifference is a medical, existential, emotional, experiential condition, right? That's something which this book tries to engage with, very philosophically, very ambitiously, and also very interdisciplinarily, right? It brings in so many disciplines: the medical, the neurobiological, the psychoanalytic, as well as, of course, the philosophical framework. We're also drawing on literature. So this is a really rich book for us who are students of literature and trauma, in terms of how literature can offer a very unique platform of representation, a very unique modality of representation, and perhaps engage with the aporia between psychoanalysis and neurobiology today. And that's where literature and philosophy can come in as very convenient and very complex methods through which we can understand this aporia, or this impassable gap between psychoanalysis and neurobiology, and how that gap can be possibly and hopefully converted into a dialogue, which is the project of this book. So let's stop at this point today, and I'll just carry on this discussion in the subsequent lectures. Thank you for your attention.